Hello, and welcome to the Weekly Watch podcast series. I'm John Briggs, Global Head of Debt Strategy. This series helps you cut through the noise of global financial markets with a quick take on the upcoming trends to watch. Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I want to share my thoughts and prayers and send them out to the people of Ukraine, especially my friends, colleagues, and any of you with friends and family that are impacted in any way by this conflict. The Russian invasion into Ukraine clearly made this past week a historic one on many fronts. It's almost difficult to know where to start when talking about the impact in a brief podcast, but we'll get to the pure geopolitical angle in a minute. But when it comes to markets, we saw and we're continuing to see incredible volatility across many asset classes. On Tuesday, for example, the height of the flight to quality bid to safe haven assets and the worst day of the week so far for risk, 10-year bonds, for example, fell 20 basis points, which is a move that has only happened twice in the last 10 years. 10-year BTP yields fell 30 basis points. The dollar saw a surge against the euro that put it near 110, which is 10% lower than the peak of last year. And sterling traded down against the dollar to near 132. But all these pale in comparison to the surge we're seeing in the energy complex. And as noted, it was a tough week for risk, with equities generally lower and credit widening, though thankfully not in any major panic for credit, which would be a real concern, more systemic concern. Now, much of this unwound on Wednesday and markets remain choppy as we record on Thursday, but it's stating the obvious to say where markets go from here depends on the developments in Ukraine. I do want to add one thought, though, and that's that the Western response is also historic in their scope, and the fact it is against a major economy and geopolitical player in Russia. This is my own observation, but when we get moves like this we had in markets or the volatility that we've seen, often there's sometimes another somewhat unseen driver, days where the feel is idiosyncratic, but then it starts to turn into a systemic feel. Often there's something else helping drive it. Unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer for our listeners today, but is it unexpected demand for cash or dollars due to turning off SWIFT? Is it something ancillary to the sanctions of the Russian central bank? A need for cash and selling of assets from firms that won't get Russia-based dividends or coupon payments? Banks seem to be wanting to raise cash, but at the same time, adding duration. I think the weekend decisions threw a rock in the water and the ripples are still spreading. I wish I had a firmer answer here, but I just want to raise that in my experience, days like we've had this week sometimes have another undercurrent contributing to moves to this extent. And if that's the case, these ripples mean that we could have more volatility down the road. So we should all be ready for that. So with that said, I want to bring in my special guest for the week, Scott Livingstone, apologies, Scott, who is international advisor to NatWest Group. Scott spent 24 years as a British diplomat and 12 years as a Royal Marine officer, giving him both diplomatic and military history and background. Scott, thanks for joining us. From a high level, my first question is, from a high level, what do you think of the developments so far? And has Russia underestimated either Ukraine's resistance or the West's response?
John, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. And so the really short answer to those questions is, well, yes and yes. I mean, the initial plan to quickly exert compelling pressure on the Ukraine government, and then probably to withdraw, I say probably, clearly failed. 1 week ago that was initiated, and it failed. And there's been a rethink. So yeah, underestimated the resistance from Ukraine, and I think overestimated the sort of popular sentiment, completely overestimated the popular sentiment. And that's why we've seen this change of plan. And I'm afraid to say plan B is much more destructive, and that's underway at the moment.
Yes, you kind of led right where I wanted to go, which is, what is Putin's staying power? I mean, is he able to extricate himself from this, or is it digging in deeper first, in your opinion? You kind of led with that, but.
Yeah, I think so. There's two staying powers I think that we need to keep an eye on. One is Putin's political staying power in Moscow, and my view on that is that's easy to underestimate. We've learned lessons in the last 20 years that isolated dictators do have staying power far longer than we would otherwise expect. And I'm assuming, I go into this assuming that Putin has political staying power to quite an extent. The other staying power that we need to monitor is the military staying power. And again, in the last week, we've seen real problems with the logistical support that for the Russian forces in Ukraine. And I think that continues to be a problem. And to be honest with you, from a military point of view, the further stretched the Russian forces become in a country as vast as Ukraine, is the more telling that staying power will be. And I think that's weaker than Putin's political staying power.
Yeah, a country of 44 million people that don't seem to be particularly siding with him at the moment. So as we think about going forward, even just in the very near term, are there some signs that we should be on the watch for that we could be heading towards a resolution, or is it, anything particular that you're watching to see if, either diplomacy or Putin looks like he might be pulling back or looking to resolve this rather than escalate it?
Well, what he's looking for, unfortunately, every sign we've seen hitherto is we see Putin wanting to, being prepared to escalate as far as it takes. There was a great quote from Fiona Hill, the sort of Putin expert, saying, how far will he go? And her view, well, he'll use everything in his toolbox, so everything. So that sideways comment about nuclear weapons, that is not to be dismissed. That's something we mustn't rule that out. So I think unfortunately we're seeing nothing but escalatory signals at the moment. I think we should look out for, again, on the battlefield, there are some signs that there are young Russian conscripts who they're coming out of their bombed out vehicles, and they don't know where they are, and they don't know why they're fighting. So I think, and there are stories of Russian conscripts not wanting to fight or surrendering. If that happens on the battlefield, that'll be an indicator. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, I think we do need to stay tuned in to signals from other senior Russian securocrats. Now, the problem we've got with that, John, is that very often that's done very discreetly, and that we in the public domain, we might not see these signals. We do rely on maybe third countries. I'm not ruling out the French initiative. Still, the French claim still to have a diplomatic channel into Moscow, and that may yet bear fruit. It didn't before the invasion, but Macron is holding this up as a possible channel to be used. And then, in my view, I'd be very interested to see if the Chinese change tack, and we see a Chinese initiative going into Moscow to aim for de-escalation. Now, that would be dramatic. It would be dramatic for Chinese foreign policy, but I think it would have considerable impact in Moscow.
Yeah, and the subject of where China is in a difficult position that they've been put in is probably a subject for a whole nother podcast, but definitely fascinating dynamic there. So one last question before I let you go, and it's completely unfair. So how long do you think that this is going to be front of mind? I mean, in your base case scenario, it seems like it's a little bit more escalation before we end up seeing a solution. The military, some of the dynamics that you were saying as a potential dynamic might take a little while to play out. It's totally fair to say that it's unpredictable, but in your mind, do you have any sense of how long investors and treasurers and CEOs, CFOs will have to kind of manage this risk in real time?
Yeah, I'll say 2 points on that, and one I'm drawing from evidence of the last week. So two data points from the last week. One is Putin's willingness to use massive force to achieve his objectives. So, he's launched something like 80% of the forces he had in Belarus and in the Russian border. 80% of that force strength is now inside the Ukraine. So he's got a willingness to use this force. He's a willingness to see cities destroyed. The other data point is the sheer gutsy capability of Ukraine defenders. So we've all been surprised by that. So I think there is a confrontation, at least for the next week or so, I think, between those two forces before we get to another point of inflection on the battlefield. I would say that the longer term trend, and there could be people on this call with better knowledge than me on this, is the energy supply problem. Now we're in March now, and Europe's heading out of winter, but it's only a few months before we start seeing that again. And politicians will have sight of next winter's energy challenge. So for me, the timeline, I'm taking next winter as a sort of, right of arc sort of dateline, but the fighting on the ground, I'm measuring it in a couple of weeks before we see some pivot point in Ukraine, actually.
Okay. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. And, with European natural gas and other energy stockpiles not exactly at the full limits here in storage, hopefully we won't get to the point where we're considering next winter, actually for many reasons. So again, thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate you joining us and appreciate your perspective on this. So that's all, everybody, for this week. Again, it's obvious in the eyes of the market and the world will be on Ukraine, but we also do have an ECB meeting, which from a market perspective, will give us the first opportunity to see how monetary policymakers will officially react. And this one's obviously the central bank that's closest to the events. And as I said at the beginning, once again, my thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and anybody who has a connection there. May your friends and family be safe in these troubling times. Talk to you all next week. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Weekly Watch. Please subscribe to our channel to get future episodes. We also encourage you to explore more of our content on our website and other social media channels.